What I love to do is introduce the right people to the right people.
I assemble the smartest people I can think of or reach out to carry that conversation, and that's exactly what I've done today.
Please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome.
Okay, guys, Jay Martin here, CEO of Cambridge House, and I'm joined right now by Scott Melbye, the CEO and president of Uranium Royalty Corp. Scott, how are you?
I'm great, Jay. It's great to join you and your viewers today.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. I'm looking forward to chatting with you because there's been a ton of hype around the uranium market recently. I've been watching it very closely. And, you know, I could say that over the last decade, doesn't matter what the uranium price is doing. If I host some uranium content at my conferences, it's like a packed room. The loyalty and dedication of uranium investors is something to behold. Now, I wanted to chat with you because, Scott, honestly, when I get excited about an idea, the first thing I do is I shortlist the top entrepreneurs in the business, the ones that I have the most confidence in. Everybody that watches my show knows I'm people over everything every single time. But then secondly, I stress test the idea with the top macro thinkers who can identify my blind spots and poke holes in my theories and identify things that I'm not seeing, right? And you tick both of those boxes. Truthfully, when I talk to a uranium exploration CEO, they often point to you as the voice of authority in the sector, that they pay a lot of attention to you. So I'm really grateful you had time to come on the show today and walk through the uranium sector with my audience. So thank you. Where I wanted to start was just, Scott, give us your perspective right now. What are the macro trends that you're paying the most attention to in the uranium market today?
Yeah, well, Jay, it's an exciting time for us. And our optimism in the uranium space is really founded from a number of different catalysts. You have the nuts and bolts, supply and demand fundamentals, which today are probably better positioned today than they've been in a very long time, which is not surprising. A commodity like uranium that has been beat down so low and so long in an 8-9 year bear market, you're bound to have supply and demand fundamentals react favorably to that. And we certainly, that's been the case with demand. Nuclear generation today has rebounded to pre-Fukushima levels. So that translates directly to uranium consumption has really recovered from Fukushima impacts over the last 7-8 years. But we've also seen the supply side cuts as a result of, first, the low uranium price, which has caused producers like Cameco, Kazatomprom, producers in Africa, Australia, United States, all cut back production to preserve their resources in the ground and sell them into a higher uranium market going forward. That was made even more profound with COVID in 2020, where we saw additional cuts to production occur as a result of health and safety concerns at mining operations around the world, which we're still not completely out of that impact. Big mine in Canada, Cigar Lake, continues to be down in Saskatchewan. I think in Kazakhstan, you're seeing mine production, down pretty significantly year over year and beginning to come out of it. But you have that great supply and demand story. The third element in those fundamentals is the utility procurement cycles, and when utilities come to the market, and they've been buying uranium in the long-term market at below normal levels now for probably 7-8 years. So that's beginning to turn, because we know the utilities, if they're operating the plants the way we know they are, their unfilled requirements are growing dramatically, and they need to go back to a normal procurement cycle. So this new market dynamic really hasn't been tested yet. But I think another thing that's really impacting our industry right now is the mega trend towards clean energy and green energy.
Right.
And those of us in the industry have always known that nuclear power provides baseload power without carbon emissions or air pollution concerns that other energy sources have. What's happening now is environmentalists, politicians, policymakers, investment communities beginning to realize the role that nuclear power plays. In the United States, we're 20% of electricity supplies in the US, but we're 55% of the carbon-free energy. So this collision of green energy megatrend and supply and demand fundamentals bodes very well for uranium going forward.
Now, then, are you seeing the perception change? Because you're right, uranium or nuclear energy has been labeled, right, with this stigma, right, which is pretty, I think, misunderstood when, to your point, it's incredibly effective, energy per square foot production, the zero carbon emissions, all this stuff. And if you don't choose nuclear, it's not like you're choosing solar or wind, you're choosing coal, right? It's a poor trade-off, in my opinion. But talk to me about that stigma, because we could point to the obvious black eye. It's just been some mistakes and some disasters. But talk to me about that stigma and how maybe that's been misunderstood. Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of safety, if you go all the way back to the beginning of nuclear power, nuclear energy has been one of the safest, if not the safest form of electricity generation when you measure the massive amounts of electricity produced since the 1950s to today. Really the glaring exception being Chernobyl, which, was a reactor type that really is not something that in the West we would ever build such a reactor, and is certainly not the reactors we're operating now or building going forward.
Right.
So it's always been safe. It's just the stigma that's carried with it. But I also think we're beginning to see also what happens if we move towards a green energy economy like Germany did over 10 years ago, but moved away from nuclear power. What has it resulted in? They have, their neighboring country, France, that's 74% nuclear today, has electricity rates half that of Germany. They have carbon emissions a tenth that of Germany's. And Germany is now beginning to see their manufacturing export economy impacted by companies leaving Germany and moving to Asia and other regions where they have cheap, affordable power. So we're beginning to see that, exactly what you said. If we go green without nuclear, you're just relying more heavily on fossil fueled electricity. In Germany, it's lignite coal or natural gas from Russia, which presents geopolitical issues for Germany and other countries to rely on Russia in that way. So we're beginning to see, with environmentalists, there's always been some that have bucked the trend and realized where nuclear fit. We're now beginning to see a much broader acceptance among maybe they fear carbon emissions from coal more than they fear nuclear energy. But hey, we're winning converts, and like I said, policy-wise, we're beginning to see real changes, and look no further than the United States with the Biden administration.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because that's been the barrier, right? It's not been technological; it's been policy-driven, right? Mm-hmm. Given your experience, Scott, what's your perspective on the Biden administration's responsiveness to nuclear energy?
Yeah, well, I've been in the nuclear energy industry 36 years, so I've seen all the changes in government policy and public perception. Generally speaking, in a Republican administration, nuclear power is a welcomed, important part of an all-of-the-above energy strategy, which is nuclear, coal, oil and gas, wind, and solar. In a Biden administration, I'm not sure we may be in a situation where we could actually be more relied on than we are in an all-of-the-above type energy policy. On day one of the Biden administration, they reaffirmed commitment to the Paris Accords, put a stop to the Keystone XL pipeline, and put a moratorium on drilling on federal lands. That's a pretty strong statement considering the amount of jobs and employment and that impacted on day one of the administration. So it kind of gives you an idea of where they're going with fossil fuels. So the fact that we're not carbon emitting, and the Democratic Party put nuclear energy in its party platform for the first time in decades bodes very well for us. Now, I think we still, as an industry, need to lobby very heavily in the new Congress and the new administration to make sure everyone has gotten the memo that nuclear is clean and green and part of the solution. But the indications we're getting out of the new administration, including the new energy secretary, which was just confirmed today, that nuclear will play a part in this new administration. And they're especially keen on this next generation of small modular reactors and advanced reactors, the kind that Bill Gates, yes, Peter Thiel, folks like this are investing in. So I think we have the potential here to build on, the currently today with 442 reactors operating around the world, increasing their capacities through uprates, extending the licenses of those big reactors, and continuing to build big reactors in India, China, Middle East, and in these emerging markets. Now we get to layer on top of that the small modular reactors, which is an entirely new and additional market for uranium going forward.
Right. Okay. Now, talk to me a little bit about jurisdiction and source country, because it's been a topic that dominates the conversation in the commodities market today, more so than it has in the previous decade. How important is that how is it important for America to develop a domestic supply? And you can factor Canada into that, but is that a priority?
Yeah, well, I wear two hats. I'm Executive Vice President of Uranium Energy Corp, which is one of the founding companies behind Uranium Royalty Corp. And I've also assumed the presidency of the Uranium Producers of America trade organization in the United States. So, we're keenly aware of those issues. I think in the United States, I think maybe due to cost pressures or just, a lot of the influence of state-owned entities producing uranium and selling into Western Europe and the United States. The United States has now found itself reliant on Russia or Kazakhstan, former Soviet countries, for about 50% of their uranium supplies, and a significant amount of the uranium enrichment supplies coming from Russia. I think that was kind of as a result of cost pressures. But now going forward, as the world is embracing nuclear power, China's emerging, Russia's building plants, 30 different plants in 12 different countries. I think the U.S. Industry and electric utility industry and European needs to look at their strategic sources of supply and look at diversity more importantly. So I think the need for, if you want to say North American uranium, Canadian and American supplies of uranium, I think will grow in importance. They've always been important. U.S. led global production in the 1980s. Canada led after that, before Kazakhstan taking over Canada. So just from a utility supply diversity, I think it's important to not be reliant too much on countries that don't always share your own best interests. We also have layer on that the United States, through our nuclear navy, the submarines, aircraft carriers, are all reliant on uranium fuel that has to be produced from U.S. domestic sources. And, we're on the verge here where we've nearly lost our capability to produce uranium for that fleet of ships and submarines. And so I think it was behind the Trump administration wanting to really revitalize the nuclear fuel cycle and nuclear energy industry in the U.S. to regain its leadership and also be able to produce its own fuel going forward. So the Strategic Uranium Reserve, which was passed funding for bipartisan basis in the last Congress and is now being instituted at the U.S. Department of Energy, will be a good first step to try to get our U.S. Domestic production base back up and running. And I think the utilities benefited as well, having a more diverse, vibrant domestic uranium industry.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned aircraft carriers and submarines, because I've been super curious about, I guess, like speculating in the future, Scott, where else nuclear power could go in terms of infiltrating all the big industries that we rely on, like shipping, transportation, big tankers, all this stuff. Do you have any thoughts there, Scott, where in a best case scenario, this technology could go?
Well, absolutely, Jay. I mean, it really is exciting right now. And we're beginning to see some of these new applications taking the existing nuclear technology and applying it in different ways, or going to advanced reactors. But take the aircraft carrier and submarines. Those are essentially small modular reactors. And they have been operating safely in wartime conditions under the Arctic and the Persian Gulf since the 1950s. So it's not surprising that sort of small modular reactor is being taken and being applied to more scalable reactors on land that can be built in a factory, shipped on site, and added to in a scalable way. The markets for that are almost unlimited. I mean, obviously, we think of rural, remote locations or island nations or states that are still relying on diesel fuel for electricity, which is incredibly dirty and very expensive. And in some places like mining operations in northern Quebec, Ontario, Northwest Territories, they're having difficulties getting the ice roads are not frozen as long in a year as they have been 20 years ago. So getting diesel oil into these mines and remote locations is getting harder. So the small modular reactors are kind of being identified as a way to move in that direction. You also have companies like Newmont Mining, the largest gold mining company in the world, has basically made a commitment to go carbon-free by 2050 in their operations. So, it's going to be hard-pressed to see how wind and solar are going to power large open-pit underground mining operations without disruption or very expensive battery backup to that kind of system. So nuclear has great applications there. But you've mentioned other things. We're hearing that the shipping industry is also being pressed to go towards carbon free or lower carbon operations. So certainly it works in that regard. Space travel, we're hearing that space travel to Mars and these planets, both for propulsion to get us into space, but also once we get there, if you're going towards the sun, okay, solar might be an option, but going the other way, it's going to be these small nuclear reactors that power space stations and perhaps even settlements on other planets. So we're really in a stage where the sky's the limit. I mean, you have nuclear power being able to produce hydrogen, which can also resolve other fuel issues as transportation may move to more hydrogen type fuel cells. The desalination of water in the Gulf states or in arid regions where you can always take seawater and make clean drinking water out of it, but it's so energy intensive. Nuclear, again, can provide electricity and clean water for those kind of applications. So, we're very, very optimistic of where we're heading in nuclear power. Again, I think we've seen the big growth stages in the 60s and 70s and the advent of commercial nuclear power. We saw, again, the nuclear renaissance rekindle that in the early 2000s. But I think this, is going to be a combination of large reactors and small reactors, and these different applications really driving uranium requirements going forward.
Right. Honestly, I was excited to hear you even mention space exploration. Just like recently, Elon Musk was back on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the limitations of solar from the standpoint of the surface area required. He predicts that solar will never actually reach a point where it could even just charge a Tesla sedan. He's like, there's just not enough surface area. We'll never get there. Maybe a minivan. We've got more surface area, but space flight, never. That's his prediction. Yeah. He's like, this will always be, it'll never work. We'll always need fossil fuels. Rogan didn't ask him about nuclear. I wish he did. That would have been interesting to hear his response. I wonder what his thoughts are.
Electric vehicles is a huge driver too. And, you'll see the United States really maybe play a little bit of catch up to some of the European nations that have made hard commitments to move towards electric vehicles. But, I think Elon Musk put it quite directly and said, if we move to that amount of electric vehicle adoption, in the developed world, we'll need to double our electricity consumption. And you're going to double electricity consumption at the same time that you're eliminating some of your largest sources of electricity presently, like fossil fuels. So Nuclear really plays a key role there. And I mean, if it's an electric vehicle and it's powered by a coal-fired power plant, it's a lignite car. It's not a clean vehicle. Yeah. So we definitely, we see, and again, you're seeing some of the tech leaders like Peter Thiel, Bill Gates. They've done the math and science, and they've seen the limitations. I mean, we only need to look at what happened in Texas this last week, California recently, South Australia, and then the example in Germany where we've seen a long-range example of what happens if you rely too heavily on renewables. There is a diminishing return. Once you have that much intermittent supply on the grid, the reliability issues become quite serious, and the cost to back that up just doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of folks in Texas are wondering, the value of having so much wind power now. In defense, it was also some gas-fired generation that was really impacted by the cold weather, distribution, and everything else. But nuclear, typically, I think in Texas last week, we had 3 out of 4 nuclear plants were in operation. The 4th unit came on after one day. So it's really just demonstrated through hurricanes and previous cold weather events. Like up in Illinois, they had the same kind of cold wave snap come through there. And, and you had nuclear power, as it always does, providing 24/7, 95% capacity factor clean energy, as opposed to wind power and solar at best, maybe 25-30% capacity factor. So that's the real rubber hits the road.
Right. Okay, I could keep on talking about this with you for forever. I do want to give my audience the chance to hear about the Uranium Royalty Corp story because it's pretty unique. It's a unique model in the uranium sector. I recall when you guys went public, I think it was the largest IPO on the venture exchange in terms of participating investors. And we had this massive crowd on my stage at our Vancouver conference in January. It was like 300 people up there clapping their hands. It was pretty rad for the market close. Super fun. So just backing up, if someone's unfamiliar, Scott, if you're buying a share of URC, what are you purchasing?
Yeah, well, URC is, as you mentioned, we launched the IPO in December of 2019. It was the largest mining IPO in Canada that year. But what we did with URC is not try to reinvent the wheel. We saw the enormous success over the last 10 to 15 years from Franco-Nevada, Wheaton Precious Metals, Sandstorm, Royal Gold, Metalla, Maverick, you name it. It's really become a $50 billion industry, providing a really attractive way for investors to get pure commodity play through diversified investments. For the investment community, from a mine development side of the equation, we're able to provide alternative mine finance in addition to debt and equity. And we've seen in base and precious metals that it's no longer alternative. It's become mainstream in terms of building the next generation of mines. Uranium is ideally suited because we don't have any such royalty streaming companies in our space, but we have a huge, probably $2 billion plus capital lift to build the mines that are needed to meet all this increased demand from reactors that we've just talked about. So, we've launched. We have 15 royalties in our portfolio. We intend to be absolutely geographically diverse and present in every major uranium developing region, whether it's Australia, Africa, Canada, the United States. We've already started with a good portfolio in place. It was made just that much better last week when we announced that we acquired royalties in McArthur River and Cigar Lake, which, it would be like having a royalty on Escondida in the copper industry or the Grasberg mine in gold. So very excited to have interest in those mines. They're obviously currently in standby or shut down due to the market and COVID, but they're obviously some of the first mines to restart as those conditions improve. So that's an example of the kind of investments we're going to make. And this, just like Franco-Nevada, started probably with 3 or 4 royalties in the portfolio. You'll see us grow, I think, exponentially in the coming years as we add counterparties to the portfolio. We're already at work looking at the follow-up deals to our McArthur and Cigar announcements. So great investment alternative. You get all the benefits of ownership in these mines without, we're a typically a top line beneficiary through royalties. We don't have the capital requirements or workforce requirements of maintaining large operations. We just get the benefit of their operations through these financial interests. So very low overhead, very low G&A. These are some of the most profitable companies per employee of any industry. And so we're certainly pleased to be up and running and have a uranium market, which is just perfectly situated for us to deploy this business model.
Yeah, and you guys have been busy since 2016. I think you said 15 agreements in the portfolio. My audience is really familiar with the model. Actually, one story we've had on a bunch this year has been Nova Royalty, third-party agreements in the copper and nickel space, appealing for many of the same reasons. So, Scott, talk to me about what's next. Are you guys in hunting mode? Are you in harvest mode? What could investors expect from you in terms of news flow?
Yeah, no, we're definitely in the hunting mode and grow. Absolute growth mode. We, like any good royalty company, you need to have great near-term, medium-term, and longer-term assets. We've got some really good sort of longer dated assets in the form of the Rough Rider project in Saskatchewan, which was a $650 million acquisition by Rio Tinto in the last cycle. That's going to be a great addition to the Saskatchewan mining scene as Cigar Lake depletes its current reserves and shifting to newer operations. So that's a great tuck away for the future. So is the Michelin deposit in Labrador. It's one of the largest undeveloped deposits in North America. But we realize investors want to see that visibility to near-term production and cash flow. So I kind of put our targets in two categories. One are mines that can either restart and produce and cash flow in this cycle, or start up, meaning they're fully permitted and don't have a long construction lead time or permitting time to get into production. It's pretty tough in uranium, so the universe is limited, but we've shown through the MacArthur and Cigar Lake it's not impossible to acquire those. So that's a very high priority for us. We're also looking at projects which may not, second category of projects that may not produce and cash flow immediately, but as the uranium price recovers into a $40 to $50 range, which we see is entirely reasonable given where we're at today, they're going to see their business models advance dramatically, and not just to generalize, but good examples would be the projects like Denison's, Fission's, NextGen's in Saskatchewan, where in a strong uranium market, their business models are really going to advance, and we'd love to have something with those projects. But we're looking in presently at projects in Australia, Africa, and elsewhere to continue to add to the portfolio.
Okay, excellent. Well, look, Scott, I'm really glad you can make time to come and chat with us today. Speaking to my audience, as you guys know, I'm all about the people, and I wanted everyone to get to know Scott. If you're investing in URC, you're investing in Scott Melbye, and now we know you. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for it, Scott. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jay.